Welcome to Lead Pods, the official leadership podcast from USMB for pastors and church leaders, where our goal is to increase our impact together.
Hello, my friends, and welcome to the USMB Lead Pods. This is episode 60, and my name is Matt Ersman. I'll be your host today, and we've got a really fun episode, another one that I've been looking forward to sharing with you. Today I'm talking to Dr. Quentin Kinnison. He is an associate professor over at Fresno Pacific, and I just really enjoy getting to know Quentin. He is one of these guys who has a really great mix of both kind of a pastor's heart and a scholar's mind. He's done a lot of research on this topic that we're going to discuss today, and he's got some personal experience. He has this term, the Theology of Disability, which I think is just so interesting, and it's something that all of us need to think about in our church leadership. So all of us have people in our church family who probably suffer from some sort of disability, and if not, we at least need to be ready if we have guests who come who have some kind of disability. And he just has lots of great things for us to think about, both on the practical end of things, as well as from the kind of the theological side of things. Like Jesus had some things to say about this. And Quentin, I just really appreciated his mind and his heart, and I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. So let's take a quick break to hear from our friends over at Fresno, and then we'll get right to my conversation with Dr. Quentin Kinnison.
Deciding on the right college is a big deal. At Fresno Pacific University, they get it. They are a private, nonprofit Christian university where your academic success is their priority. The Mennonite Brethren roots run deep from the classroom to the field. Professors connect you to research and internships. Financial aid makes your education affordable, and with their 4-year guarantee, you'll graduate on time to launch your career. Visit fpu.edu for more information about their undergrad, graduate, and degree completion programs. Fresno Pacific University. Possible happens here.
All right, my friends, well, I'm excited to introduce you to a new friend that I just met from Fresno Pacific. Today we're talking to Dr. Quentin Kinnison. He is the Associate Professor of Christian Ministry over there at FPU. He's also written, I think, 3 books. If you Google him, you will find a very impressive bio. He has won some awards. He's done a lot of research projects. He's done a lot of articles that people have a lot of nice things to say about. So I'm very humbled and honored to be talking to you today, Quentin. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, and I paid good money for those kind comments, so I'm glad it's paying off. Yeah, thanks.
There you go. You have a very impressive online persona. I'm very impressed.
Thanks.
All those accolades aside, we chatted a little bit. Can you tell us more about you, your family? What else do you want to tell us before we kind of dive in here today?
Yeah, so I'm married. My wife and I have been married for 32 years. We have a daughter who's 14, going to be 15 soon, adopted from China. She's just an amazing kid. And then the other thing I would say is, when I do my bio, from the Phoenix area, although I was born in Wyoming, Phoenix is kind of home base for me. So I'm a diehard Phoenix Suns fan. I root for my Diamondbacks, but I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan, so that kind of ruins everything for people after that. Grew up in a Baptist home for the most part. My parents were Southern Baptists, came to faith through Billy Graham crusade. Mm-hmm. And then Dad sensed the call to ministry despite trying to run away from it. So we ended up following him to Grand Canyon College then, now Grand Canyon University, later Southern Seminary, and then back to Phoenix, where I spent most of my formative years. So, yeah.
Very cool. I know you were a pastor for many years. I like you. It seems like you've got a kind of unique, but I like a good blend of ministry, but also this studious, you do a lot of research. You kind of have both of those worlds, which I think is a really cool perspective to have on, especially on the topic that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's this idea of praxis is really important to me. This idea, this combination between theory and practice. And I come from a school of thought that says that, you know, the way you think affects how you act, and the way you act affects how you think, and these things are interconnected. Mm-hmm. And God's Spirit working in and through both the mind and also the actions is a way in which God is shaping us and forming us to the image of Christ. Yeah. So as we talk about here at FPU with the ministry programs, it's this important connection between not just what you're learning in the classroom, but what you're practicing in the church office or in the in the field or wherever is really, really critical. And so a lot of what I'm doing. Yeah, a lot of what I'm doing in the classroom is centered around also the experiences that we've had and then how we're continuing to have those experiences. So thank you.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. So the main thing we're going to talk about today, which I kind of gather is one of just the biggest passions of your life, which I think is awesome, It's a phrase I've never heard before, but I'm really excited to dive into it. So this phrase of the theology of disability. So real quick, can you give us the big picture view? What does that term mean, and why is it something that you're so interested in?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, so there's a whole field that's actually growing in this area. Schools like Baylor. There's a school in Edinburgh that's doing really work around this, but it comes down to this idea of what do we think, or how do we respond to people's brokenness in their lives, and not just the brokenness that they experience and encounter, but also the brokenness of society as we encounter people who have certain kinds of what we call disabilities. And so, really, in many ways, yeah. It's kind of an older field. Johnny Erickson Tata, who I'm sure you're familiar with, really kind of began a process of shaping people's thoughts and minds, particularly in the life of the church. So the quick version of how I got connected into this idea, when I started at Fresno Pacific about 14 years ago, I was introduced to a guy by the name of David Hooker, who was the Central Valley Johnny and Friends representative.
Okay.
And he invited me to join him in a process of helping shape the life of churches around this thought of how do we reach and care for people affected by disability. Johnny has said on a number of occasions that one of the most unreached people groups in the world are people affected by disability.
Yeah.
So when you begin to think about that has some effect for how we think about what is it about our view of the world that we aren't connecting and reaching people, but also what does it say about our theology, our belief systems, that we don't see that as a viable way of approaching people. And so starting that process, began to ask the question, okay, what do we do with this? And out of that came an invite from our School of Education at Fresno Pacific, the special ed program, to begin to offer just a 1-unit course for special educators to think about their theology of disability. And it's a great class to teach because these are not theologians, these are not ministerial folk, these are school educators, and so they come into a class where they're going to study theology and they're freaked out totally. It's fantastic. So I spend usually the first part of that class just saying to them, hey, look, my job here is to help give you language for what you already are experiencing, to help you begin to recognize and understand what's going on. Because I think that it's true that all of us have a theology around our encounter of people affected by disability. All of us have a theology, and whether that's a good theology or a bad theology, we all have a theology. And my experience has been that people who work directly with folk affected by disability, whether it's students or if they're seniors, the largest group of people affected by disability in our churches today are senior adults. But we tend to think of the kids, right? The ones that are in special ed programs and things like that.
Right.
But we all have this kind of theology, and so how do we begin to put shape to a good theology and begin to understand and see people as God sees them, right? To recognize their value, their worth, their beauty, their goodness that they can bring to the life of a congregation if we simply just begin to look and view that differently. Yeah. So we do a lot of work in unpacking things like, why do we spend so much time in theodicy? We asking the question, answer the unanswerable questions, right? We spend a lot of time there, but not enough time thinking about what does it mean to include people who are different from us, who seem to be outside of the norm. And so our theology really begins to lean into how that shapes. Yeah.
I'm so glad you've devoted so much time because it's such an important topic, especially I think today's culture. We just really need to address this in the church. I want to be careful, and you can talk as much about this as you want to.
Sure.
This is a personal issue for you, right? Like I saw a video online that you talked about. You had a diagnosis that kind of came out of left field. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, so a guy by the name of Thomas Reynolds talks about this idea of normalcy, that we all live with this idea of what is normal in our world. And we have what he talks about is we've tended to define normal in really abnormal ways. So it's the supermodel and the superstar, right? The supermodel is what's normal, and so everybody else is trying to approximate that. And the degree to which you can become normal by approximating the superstar or the supermodel. And by the way, both we know now, right, that both of those are really probably not real. The steroid scandals, the airbrushing and stuff, we kind of come back and say, wait a minute, the ideal we've set is not right. Yeah. So in my own life, I have passed all my life as somebody who has, pretty much a normal life. You would look at me and say, that person, he's okay. With the exception of the glasses, right? He gets along just fine. Sure. Played basketball in high school, fairly athletic as far as that stuff goes during those years. Still engaged in some of those kinds of activities. But about 13 years ago, right after we came home with our daughter, I began to have a series of infections. I began to encounter a number of different really odd kind of things that just aren't normal part of our experiences. I ended with childhood herpes, which means your gums swell up, right, and it gets really sore. And my doctor looks at me and goes, "You shouldn't have that. You're way too old for this," you know.
Oh, interesting.
And so ended up with pneumonia twice. And after the third kind of major thing that my primary care physician, who by the way is fantastic, looked at me and said, "You know, I think there's something else going on here. We need to test some things." And so they began testing my antibody response, my body's ability to create antibodies. She did an initial test and discovered that in fact my antibodies were not as high as they should be. They sent me to an immunologist who was again wonderful Christian man. Really, really fascinating. Every once I have to remind him, we're here to do my doctor's work, not the theology work, right? So, but he was able to test me a second time, and by the time it's like the 3 months between my primary care physician and my immunologist, my antibodies completely dropped off. So antibodies are those things. I mean, I think we all know this now with COVID, right? But our antibodies are those things that our body uses to respond to bacteria or to viruses or other things. And it creates an active response that occurs so that when you encounter a virus or a bacteria, your body goes and attacks it, kills it, and then sends a message for the rest of the body to come and attack it.
Yeah.
My body doesn't do that. So as far as a line of defense goes, I'm missing a significant element. So while everybody's getting their vaccines, and I know it's controversial, I encourage people to get their vaccines. While everybody's getting their vaccines, when I get the vaccine, it doesn't actually produce the effect that it was supposed to.
Okay.
And so as a result of that, I become more susceptible to all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And so now all of a sudden here I have this appearance of normalcy, right? I can approximate, maybe not to the supermodel or superstar athlete, but I can approximate that, but I look like things are okay. And yet the reality is I'm actually much more vulnerable than it looks. So that began to raise for me some questions around this question of disability and theology of disability, right? Why is it I get a pass in our social constructs, right? Why is it I get included in, but a person with cerebral palsy or a person who has autism or something else is more excluded? Yeah. It begins to raise questions about how we show partiality to people based upon our cultural understandings of normalcy. Right. Rather than, the reality that they're a person valued by God and loved by God because they're a human being shaped in the image of God. Right. And so that personal experience really opened for me a new way of recognizing this reality and experience.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's cool that you have that personal element to it. So one thing I was thinking about when I was kind of getting ready for this is it seems like I think we all know the importance of special needs, both like in the church and in the schools. Like I think everyone would say that's a good thing. We're supportive of it, but I think we have a tendency, our level of care and empathy seems to ratchet up when either it affects us personally or we know someone, right? And so I don't know when that diagnosis came in your range of things in your career, but I guess, do we need to feel bad about that? Is that just natural? Like, it seems like we should care about this, but usually it takes some kind of an event or
personal event
for us to really kind of ratchet up how we interact. Do you feel like that's true? And is that necessarily a bad thing?
That's a great question. Should we feel bad about it? I'm of the mind that conviction is one thing, guilt is another. Guilt immobilizes, conviction compels us to action and activity. So we ought to feel convicted when we become aware of something that's not right in our world. Sure. If we feel guilty, I think that too often that causes us to shut down. So if that makes any sense. One thing I would hope is from things like this, the podcast, and from the work that I'm doing in other places, that people become more aware of the fact that this is a real thing. Sure. And I would say that for two reasons. One, there is a tremendous need to reach an unreached people group, right? There are people that God loves desperately, that God cares for deeply, that feel unloved because of the way society and cultures have identified this normalcy, and they don't fit in that frame. Yep. And that's a framework that the world has imposed. There's an idea called the homogeneous unit principle, that people like themselves. And it's true. We see that in Scripture. We see that in other places. But it's not necessarily because that's a good thing. It's because that's our brokenness works in this world. Right. Yeah. Right. And so God is doing this amazing thing through Pentecost. Pentecost Sunday just passed, right? So God's doing this amazing thing through Pentecost to help us begin to recognize the way in which God is drawing us into one family with all the beauty of difference and distinction, that we can become a real people. Well, that includes this thing with disability, right? People affected by disability have differences. And just real quick, I think of disability in two different ways. There's kind of the language in the disability circles are there's disability and there's differently abled, right?
Okay.
So we talk about people like me who have a physical ailment that affects my ability to do certain things physically. Sometimes people with cerebral palsy, that kind of fits in there. That's different from people who are the language of neurodivergence, right? So the autism spectrum, things like that. They have abilities. They're just very different than the kinds of abilities most of us think about. So if you give a task to somebody who has a high functioning autism spectrum, they have a tremendous ability to focus, to do this work, to really do it with excellence, to pay attention to the details. We just don't value that in the same way maybe we value some of these other social things that they don't produce. So they're differently abled versus somebody who's disabled. So as we think about all of that, I think what I would say is, I don't know that we need to feel bad, but we need to become aware. And then we need to begin asking different set of questions, right? What does it mean to create an environment where people who are either disabled or differently abled are able to live into their sense of purpose and calling, into their identity as human beings, living in community with other human beings? Because the real injury of disability is not always the physical. I mean, we often look at suffering as being about the physical suffering. And for some people, there is real physical suffering. I don't typically experience that because mine's, again, pretty, it only happens when I get sick, right? But some people do have physical suffering. But the real suffering comes from the fact that we're created to be in community with people, and people affected by disability are excluded from community.
Right.
So I think what we have to begin to ask is, okay, how do we create an environment where people who are affected by disability or are differently abled can recognize that they are valued and loved in the community, and not in spite of, right, but because they are people of value and worth before God. I think that's the piece where I say, rather than feeling, guilty or, bad, how do we begin to see differently? How do we begin to see people the way God sees them and begin to love them accordingly?
Yeah, that's great.
Can I add one more? Can I add more thing on that?
Go for it. Yep. And
it's not just for the people affected by disability, by the way, right? I mean, at the end of the day, this is also about the community.
Absolutely.
There's a great story in 2 Kings. I say great story is the wrong way of saying that. There's a famine, people are eating their kids. It's not a great story, but there's this amazing story in 2 Kings chapter 7. So it's the siege of Samaria. It's happening. There's terrible things are going on. They're eating their kids, like I said. They can't find any food. And the king's had it. He's going to have, Elisha killed. And Elijah makes a prediction, right? It's going to be okay. God's going to provide. There are 4 lepers. They're actually outside the wall. Right? So in Reynolds' work, he talks about this idea of body capital. The body capital is the things we can produce that gives value to a society, right? He says, if you don't have body capital, that's when you're excluded. But if you do have body capital, you're included. Okay. Well, what classic example of that is there than a siege, right? Everything of value is inside the city. Everything that's not of value is outside the city. Right. These 4 lepers are outside the city. They're going to die. They either go in the city and die with everybody by starvation, or they go to the Assyrians and figure it out. So they go, and they end up being the ones who discover that God has scattered the enemy. There's this really great phrase in there that talks about their response to that. It said, today is a day of, and the word is good news. Now in the Septuagint, that word is actually the euangelion, the word good news we translate in the New Testament as the good news. Yeah, okay. There's this today is a day of good news. And God will punish us ever so severely if we don't go and deliver this message to our people. Yeah, wow. The lepers, the ones who are excluded, become the instruments of God's good news, right? Yeah. And how many times do we as a faith community miss out on God's good news in our presence because we've excluded people who are the gospel bearers, for lack of a better way of saying it, in our midst? So it's not just about what the benefit for people affected by disability. It's also about the community of faith. Right.
Yeah, that's a great example. I love that. Yeah. Okay, I can already tell our time's gonna go very fast today. We got a lot I want to hit too. So I want to make sure we leave some time to talk about specifically people in ministry, people in churches, what we can do differently, more effectively. But first, I'm really glad you mentioned the differently abled versus disabled. That's one of my questions for you is I think a lot of times people who aren't, either they're not educated or they're not directly in this world, I think sometimes unintentionally, like our language is either hurtful or we might kind of separate people in ways that we don't mean to.
Yeah.
Even the word normal, I would imagine we should
Right.
maybe rethink the usage of that word. But
Yep.
something that I think you talk about in one of your books or articles or somewhere was the idea of people first language,
Yeah.
which I think would be just a good thing to educate people on. I've noticed that you've been doing that even in our discussion so far. So can you explain what that is and what else might we be doing that's either hurtful or ineffective that we're just blind to if we're not in this world very often?
Yeah, so there are a couple different things I would say. First of all, yeah, the people first language is the first most important thing. One of the problems we have is we tend to, for instance, that person, the blind guy, right? He's blind.
Yeah.
Well, he is blind, but he isn't his blindness.
Right. He's a person first.
He's a person first, right?
Yeah, right.
A person who is crippled.
Yeah.
The crip.
Or even like an autistic child, right? We hear that kind of thing.
Autistic kid, right?
Yeah, right.
He's a child with autism.
Right.
And so this idea of using people first language, so I try to model that, people affected by disability. People are, first of all, I think more of us are affected by disability than we realize. That's a different conversation. Yep. But using that people first language begins this way of reorienting our own sense of thinking. So we see folk as people first, not as their disability first. Right. The person in a wheelchair, not the wheelchair bound person. Right. There's a different way of engaging that. And so starting with the language and how we think about those things, I think is really important. I think the other thing too is, the education of self is part of that process. But, assuming people need help because they're affected by disability rather than asking them if they want help, right? Yeah. That's another way we do it. We make assumptions based on our ability that they should have this ability. If they don't, then there's something wrong with them and we need to make up for that deficiency. Yeah. They may not need our help. They may not want our help. So rather than assuming that on them, how do we ask them, right? This is particularly important for people affected by wheelchairs that are wheelchair bound. People in wheelchairs, the wheelchair is an extension of their body. Right. So don't automatically assume they want you to push. Right. I wouldn't go behind you, Matt, and start pushing you down the aisle because you need help. Right. Unless you ask me to. Right. Yeah. So why would we do that with a wheelchair? So things like that, they become a way of recognizing the humanity and the personhood of a person. Yeah. Rather than the way that their disability manifests as being their dominant trait.
Well, and while we're on there, so how much, again, just for people who are maybe, because I think usually, like if someone's pushing a wheelchair, they're trying to be helpful, right? Right, absolutely. The heart is right, yeah. Right, absolutely. And I think another thing that we do that, again, might go the wrong way, kind of like what you were just saying, if we see someone in our church that maybe has a disability, we might kind of go out of our way to try to help them, like you were just saying, but sometimes that might actually just draw more attention or whatever. So if someone listening, we have a lot of people, again, leaders in churches, maybe if they don't have many steps in this ironed out yet, how much do we pay attention to that and how much do we ignore it? And how do we do that really carefully? Yeah. So I think again, the danger is we can be so worried about stepping on somebody's toes that we actually end up ignoring them. Right. Yeah. Right. And that gets to that exclusion factor that we talked about. If I wanted to know if you needed something, I would get to know you first. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I sit down, I have conversations with you, I get to know who you are, I ask if you need anything, right? Yeah. I wouldn't assume what you need, I'd ask, do you need anything? So I'd have those conversations. And of course, there are levels to which people are comfortable engaging, right? So we talk about somebody who is on the autism spectrum, you might want to think about, okay, how do I approach this person, right? What would be helpful to them? How do I engage them? But it starts with getting to know the person first, right? So rather than stepping in as I'll use the language, stepping in as a savior to rescue them and save the day. Right. How do you come alongside them as a friend and begin to know them and care for them in a way that a friend would? Yeah. And likewise, are there places where you can invite them to help you and to care for you? Right? Yeah. Because it's a mutual relationship. It's not one that's built on kind of this, it's predicated on this idea that I'm better than you, so I'm going to help you. Yep. It's built on this idea that, hey, we're in this together. I need you, you need me. What can I do for you? Hey, can you help me think about this? Relationship, right? It's always back to relationship. Yeah, absolutely. I like that approach. So I work on staff at a church. I'm sure a lot of people listening do. So one of my first thoughts as we're talking is there's kind of the helping or reaching out or getting to know the people in your already in your church that have some kind of disability. But I think there's also this desire to have our facilities or services or ministries kind of ready to go if a person with a disability comes, right? So like if it's a Sunday morning or if it's a kids program, or I'm glad I'm checking myself because I first think of kids, right?
Sure. It's our natural tendency.
Also elderly, right? So what are, just from your experience, your research, what are some things that churches typically aren't doing that we should, maybe especially just so we can be ready if someone comes to one of our churches, we're ready and not behind? Yeah.
So I think one of the first things I'd say is pay attention to barriers that are created, physical barriers, right? Mm-hmm. So if you have a children's programming that's on the second floor that's only accessible by stairs, you've automatically excluded children in wheelchairs unless you're going to take them up the stairs. And we've had that. I've been a part of churches where that's happened, where people use carry them up the wheelchair, up the stairs. Yeah. And it's so humiliating for the kid, for the parents, right, to have this, and it's hard Sunday after Sunday. So think about physical barriers that are created. Yeah. So that's the first thing. Do you have is there, if you call people to an altar call, right, what does that mean for somebody who takes a little longer to move and to get there? Sure. Can they hear? Can they see? Is it super loud? Right. So for people who are on the spectrum, super loud noises can be really troubling, difficult. Yeah. Is there a space that they can be where that can be accommodated? Are there ways in which headphones or things can be used? Yeah. If people have a tendency to cry out because of a particular condition they might have, is that still okay in your service? Right. How do the leaders of the church communicate? We're just glad they're here. We're not worried about that.
Yeah.
Don't let that distract you. Let that be a reminder that God's beautiful people are present with us. Right? Yeah. So things like that. So how do physical barriers, how do kind of social barriers instigate there? Again, most places that are near some place that has a Johnny and Friends organization, or one of their denominations have their own regional groups, ask them to come in and do an assessment for you. What barriers might be in the way. Yeah. Second thing is have a plan. Too often, we get surprised. And the kid shows up and they've got autism, and we tell them, oh no, don't leave sleep, we'll be fine. But we don't have a way of planning for that. Right. Does he need to have a buddy? Does she need to have somebody, right, that's with her the whole time? If loud noises are hard for that person, for that child, or for that person, is there a place they can go to be away from that loud noises? Are we expecting somebody to sit that is constantly in motion? Right? Yeah. Are we asking people to? Thinking about our language, right? Ask them to stand, right? Everybody stand, right? Well, not everybody can stand. So this is where the language, if you're able, please rise, as you worship as where you are. So things like that become part of it. So again, a lot of it comes back to awareness and recognizing. And then I think, again, if you're blessed to have people in your church who are already affected, begin to ask them some questions. Yeah. Where are we creating barriers? Where is it harder for us? How do we do that? But do so with the recognition that there may be some hard things you hear that you didn't intend.
Right.
But they have to be thought through. So I don't know if that answers the question or not. It's a kind of starting point. Yeah.
It definitely does. And again, one of the ministries hard, right?
Right.
Every church ministry is hard. Every staff's different. Every city is different. So one thing, again, just because I work at a church, what's going through my mind is I work at a pretty big church,
right?
And we have people who think our music is too loud. We have people who think music's too quiet. You think it's too light or it's too dark, or
sure.
We're blessed with enough space where we probably could find a room if someone needed to go on their own. We probably could find a room where they could do that. A lot of churches may not have that luxury, and even. I'm thinking about number of volunteers. Like I know our church struggles to have enough volunteers for a kids ministry at all, let alone if we're going to try to start having buddies. And so again, our goal is not to make anyone, like you said, we're not trying to make any church feel guilty for not doing things. But just as I'm thinking to myself, it can be kind of daunting. So what's a good first step? Like, should we at least just have a person who's kind of keeping an eye on these things, or is there a checklist we can follow? What's kind of a good first step if this sounds intimidating?
Yeah, I think it needs a champion. There needs to be a champion, somebody who'll step up and say, hey, I want to be the person who kind of helps us to think about these things. I'm concerned about this. It's something I care about. It's something I believe that God's placed a call in my life to pursue as far as for our church's ministry. and I want to be that champion. Sometimes it's a pastor, sometimes it's a church leader, sometimes it's a lay person who just, they care. It might be a teacher. Oftentimes special ed teachers come to their churches and they're like, I see what we need to be doing and we're not doing. I can help us with that. And then what I would say is to the pastor and church leaders, empower them and support them. Lauren Annan, who was the last director that I worked with here at Johnny and Friends for a while, she's a pastor's wife. She was also a special ed, actually did way more than that, but worker. But she went to her church and she started their ministry at a church here locally. And it started with her and her passion, but she had the support of her pastors to really step in and do that work. And so the pastors would make announcements like, hey, we're going to have guests that are going to be here. And it may not always be like you're used to. But we want to welcome them and love them because that's what God's called us to do. Yeah. So I think it needs a champion. I think the other thing I would say is it just needs to be based in love. No church can do everything. Even the big churches can't do everything. A small church, it can't do everything. So how do you create an environment where people feel loved and welcomed? Maybe they go to the foyer when the music's on, right? Or maybe you create an environment where they can feel comfortable to get up and to walk in the back of the worship center, and everybody understands that that's what's going on. It's less about the big programmatic things and more about the small ways we begin to recognize that might lead to programmatic things, right? Right. But think about how we care for people as people, and then likewise, again, how do we let them care for us, right? Yeah. Is there a way that we could, think about it. If loud sounds are hard for people, what about creating space for silence or quiet in a worship service? Yeah. Well, you know what? We live in a busy world. Yeah. Silence is a really important space for us to encounter and engage God. Yeah. Yeah. It might be that God's telling us I love your worship. I love the loud, but I also want you to have the quiet so you can be, still before me. Yeah. So I think that's a part of the process as well. Yeah, that's really good. Okay, well, I know you got a class you need to teach here in just a few minutes. But one more, just as we begin to wrap up. Yeah, again, I love and respect the combination of academics and your kind of pastoral experience. So just to wrap things up, again, I love the phrase of theology of disability. Yeah. So again, with your kind of pastor heart, this is important, right? Like, I think we have there's all the stories about Jesus caring for the little children, right? But everybody. So is there anything else kind of on the theology side, or just the reminder of the importance of the individual? What else haven't we talked about yet that you want to kind of include? Yeah, I think we need to pay attention to the way we read Scripture and the way we come to the biblical text and understand some things about it. If we don't understand culture and context in which Scripture is being written and what's happening there, we can miss some of the really important cues. So we oftentimes look at the miracles and see them only as being about physical healing, and they are about physical healing. I don't want to deny that, but really, in many ways, they're about much bigger issues than the physical healing. And they have to do with things like, you're talking about a culture where there's no real social safety net. You're talking about a culture where disease or illness or disability means significant societal exclusion. So when Jesus heals the leper, right, and he says to him, "What? Go and show yourself before the priest, so that you can what? Be deemed clean and allowed to reintegrate into society. So you can come back to your family, to your work, your job, to your community, to your worship, to all that stuff." So I think we need to begin to recognize the ways in which, in that cultural context, the physical healing was more about the social healing and the integration back into community than it was about the physical. And I think we also need to recognize the ways in which, what does it mean to worship and I'm going to say this, it's a phrase that sometimes people will get uncomfortable with, but a disabled Savior. Jesus still has his scars. Yeah, right? That's interesting. He does. They don't go away after the crucifixion. So he is a scarred Savior. Right. So what does that mean to recognize, right, that in Scripture, there's some strong speculation that Paul probably had epileptic seizures or had some kind of serious ailment. He couldn't see, so he had to write with large letters, right? So what does that mean that God's using somebody like Paul, who might have this kind of serious part of life? So we need to begin to read Scriptures with eyes that say it's not just about healing, it's not just about restoring people's physical bodies, That stuff will all take care of itself. But if we begin to look at the things like, how do we recognize their basic humanity? How do we recognize their need for social integration? How do we recognize the need for meaningful participation in community? Means that they give back to us. How do we recognize? If we begin to see that part of it, I think that's really important. And the last thing I'll say, and this is kind of my last kind of theological perspective, 2 Corinthians talks about this idea, we hold this treasure in broken jars. We're all disabled on some level.
Yes, right.
We all are.
Yep.
Some of us just can hide it better than others.
Right.
So if we begin to approach the conversation with humility of, I'm broken in some ways that you can't see, and just because you're broken in ways that I can see, we're more alike than we are different.
Right.
And yet somehow God's treasure is able to reside in this beautiful broken jar, just like the beautiful broken jar that you are. Yeah. And that's what it means to be God's people, to hold this treasure together in our brokenness.
Oh, I love that. That's a great reminder that we all have those disabilities that, may or may not be quite as noticeable. Okay, so I know I said that was the last question. Last thing I want to wrap up with. Yeah. So again, you've got Welcoming Children with Special Needs, your book. It's on Amazon. I'm sure people can find it.
Let me say a quick word about that. So the book is made for Christian schools, so K through 12 schools. Mm-hmm. But there are pieces in there that will be very helpful to churches. I just want to make sure people understand what they're getting when they buy the book.
Sure. So definitely check that out for sure. You've mentioned Johnny Erickson Tada a few times. Is that, again, I'm sure that maybe be a good first resource for people to look into. Yeah,
Johnny and friends, their work is really profound. They're doing good work. And they have resources specifically to help churches come and begin to think about how to start ministries at the very base level, right? What does it mean just to offer a respite? What does it mean to just have somebody to take care? What does it mean just to be aware of what's happening? So they are a great resource for churches. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Quentin, it's been a pleasure getting to know you. Thank you for educating us on this topic. I love the work you're doing. So thank you for what you're doing at FPU and all your other outlets. This is such an important topic. So thank you for sharing so openly with us today. It's been great getting to know you.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a privilege. Thank you.
Well, once again, many thanks to Quentin. I just really enjoyed getting to know him, and I hope you enjoyed that episode as well. And ever since I talked to him, that quote that he mentioned where people affected by disability are one of the most unreached people groups, that's just really stuck to me. And that's something that I think we as church leaders really need to wrestle with and really figure out how we can do that more effectively. So I hope something that Quentin said today encouraged you or challenged you or maybe gave you some resources to figure out how your church might be able to reach out to these people a little bit more effectively. It's something that we all need to be very mindful of. So many thanks to Quentin for today's episode and for the work that he's done. And hey, while I have you, it's a couple weeks out since the convention in Kansas City. I got to meet several of you. I had such a great time getting to know you and hear from the great speakers that we had lined up at the convention, which hopefully many of you heard on the podcast before the convention. So if you came up and said hi to me at the convention, or even if you were just there, thank you for taking time out of your busy lives to come. I just think it was a really worthwhile thing for us to gather and learn together and worship together. And that was my first USMB convention, and I really, really enjoyed it. I'm glad I got to go. So I hope you did as well. And if you weren't able to go, I hope you come next time. So stay tuned to the podcast, Christian Leader, and we'll be sure to let you know for the next time we gather as a USMB family. Okay, and with that, I think we should wrap it up. So thank you again so much for listening today, wherever you are. Hope you have a great week, great weekend, and we'll see you next time right here on the Lead Pods.
Thanks for listening to Lead Pods. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing to our show wherever you're listening today. Learn more by visiting usmb.org and be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'll see you next time as we learn more practical tools to increase our impact together.